The land Colt Reddick called home was a brutal testament to how little the Lord meddled in a man's fate. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It stretched wide across the Wyoming territory, endless, raw, and unyielding. The ground was baked hard as iron, painted in the dull gold of sun-scorched earth and the gray-green of stubborn sagebrush. The wind never quit. It prowled the plains like a restless ghost that couldn't find peace. In summer, that wind came dry and mean, stealing the moisture from a man's lips, throwing grit into his teeth, whispering about droughts and dying crops. Come winter, it sharpened into a knife. It screamed down from the northern peaks, carrying snow that blinded and cold so deep it bit the marrow. The sun offered no mercy either. In July, it was a white-hot hammer, turning the prairie into cracked plates of clay beneath a sky so pale it looked hollow. In January, it mocked the land, a cold coin shining over miles of frozen stillness. Colt's ranch, a stout log house, a weather-beaten barn, and a few lean-tos stood like a lone outpost against that empty, godless sea. It wasn't built for comfort. It was built for survival. Into this world came Josie Hale. The stagecoach rolled to a stop before the ranch wheels, screeching dust swirling. When the door opened, she didn't step down like someone arriving home, but like someone with nowhere left to run. Wrapped in a faded gray cloak, its frayed edges fluttering in the wind, she held a small, scuffed valise, the sum of her life, in one hand. Colt stood on the porch, arms crossed, broad shoulders blocking the doorway. His face was carved from sun and wind expression unreadable. He wasn't a man who offered easy welcomes. He watched her walk the path toward him, steady but tired eyes fixed on the dirt. He hadn't agreed to take her in out of kindness. It was a debt, a promise made to a dead man. Grant McCoy, Josie's husband, had served beside him years ago. They weren't friends in the way men share whiskey or laughter, but brothers born of hardship and gunfire. Grant had been solid and brave, and Colt owed him. When a letter from Major Dutton came describing the widow's plight, Colt's reply was short. "Send her. She can cook." Mr. Reddick. Her voice was low, nearly lost in the wind. "Ma'am," he grunted, giving her a curt nod. He took the valise from her, it was lighter than it looked, and jerked his head toward the house. This way. No pleasantries. She didn't seem to expect any. He showed her the small room off the kitchen, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair. Clean, plain, serviceable. Colt lived hard, but he lived orderly. "The kitchen's through there," he said. "Meals at sunup, midday, and sundown. Flowers in the pantry, salt pork in the cellar. Water's out back. You'll figure the rest." "Thank you, Mr. Reddick," she murmured, eyes lowered. He nodded once, and left her the sound of his boots fading, until only silence filled the house again. Days slipped by in a steady rhythm. Josie moved like a quiet ghost. Soft steps, sure hands leaving behind the scents Colt hadn't known in years. Fresh bread, stew simmering, coffee strong enough to cut the dawn chill. She rose before the first hint of light stoked the stove, worked without pause. She mended his shirts with stitches so small they near vanished. Out back she found a patch of dead soil, and with stubborn patience began coaxing green life from it. She did it all in silence, no humming, no idle chatter. When she did speak, her words were simple, measured. Colt started noticing the stillness in her eyes, the way her fingers would tighten around her skirt when thunder rolled or the fire popped too loud. He knew that look, someone carrying ghosts. The letter had told him enough: her husband killed in an Apache raid, horrors no woman should have seen. He found himself respecting her strength more with each passing day. He was no stranger to grief himself. Ada Moore. His wife had died slow from fever 5 years back, leaving him hollowed out and wary of ever feeling again. Since then, the house had been just a shell. Josie's presence disturbed that quiet emptiness, but somehow it also made it livable again. He caught himself noticing the small changes: the fixed curtain, the warm plate, the smell of clean linen. Little things, but to a man half dead inside, they meant the world. He stayed grateful, but kept the feeling at arm's length. Gratitude could turn dangerous when loneliness lived right beside it. Josie's presence had become both comfort and disruption. The order she brought was a quiet blessing, yet the sight of her moving about Ada's old kitchen gnawed at Colt Reddick like a splinter he couldn't pull free. He found himself comparing them, something he despised himself for doing. Ada had been laughter and sunlight. Josie was still water under storm clouds. Yet her steady hands, her fierce commitment to keeping the small world around them from falling apart, began to work on him in ways he hadn't expected. He hadn't realized just how much he'd let life slip into neglect. The curtains were mended. His coffee was always hot. The smallest comforts, things he hadn't known he'd missed, began to return. Gratitude crept in quietly, but he kept it locked tight, wary of letting it take root too deep. The change came with the first blizzard of the season. It swept across the plains like the wrath of heaven, white and wild, devouring the world. For 2 days the storm raged. The wind shrieked around the eaves and slammed against the door as if the bitter creek itself wanted in. By the second night, they were trapped in the dark. Colt had just come in from the barn, ice clinging to his coat and beard, after checking on the horses and cattle. He stomped the snow from his boots, expecting to find Josie by the fire, as usual, her hands busy with mending. But the room was dim, the embers low, the oil lamp dry. For a moment he thought she'd gone to her cold little room off the kitchen. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it nearly vanished beneath the wind's fury. A broken, trembling sob. His eyes adjusted to the shadows. She sat huddled on the hearth rug, arms locked around her knees, face buried in her skirts, her shoulders shaking under the weight of grief she'd hidden too long. Colt froze where he stood, a trespasser on private pain. His instinct was to turn away, to grant her the solitude she always clung to. But something held him still. In her small, crumpled form, he saw his own emptiness mirrored back, the years of silence, the ache that never healed. The walls around his heart, built brick by brick after Ada's death, cracked a little that night. He didn't speak. Instead, he took a heavy log from the pile and placed it gently on the embers. The wood hissed, then caught, spreading gold light through the gloom. He struck a match, lit a lamp, and the soft glow filled the room. Josie lifted her face, eyes glistening. She wiped at her tears, shame coloring her cheeks. Colt only gave a small nod and turned away, pretending to busy himself at the stove. But the image of her tear-streaked face burned in his mind like firelight in the dark. Something between them had shifted. The silence no longer felt hollow. It carried a new, unspoken warmth. After the storm, the thaw began outside and within. Their words came hesitantly at first, a mention of the weather, a question about the garden, a story about a stubborn calf. Josie listened, truly listened, and Colt found himself saying more than he'd meant to. Their shared meals became quiet rituals. The scrape of spoons and soft talk filled the space where ghosts once lingered. He caught himself watching her hands as she worked, graceful and sure. Sometimes she caught him looking. A faint blush touched her cheeks before she turned away. Their glances began to linger, a flicker, a heartbeat too long. He learned her small signs, the downturn of her lips, when she was tired, the fleeting spark in her eyes, when a seedling pushed through the frost. He was learning her the way a rancher learns the sky, slowly, carefully, reverently. But winter hadn't finished testing them. One night, the cold came back sharp as a knife. The wind slipped through the cracks in the logs and bit through the air. Colt sat by the fire, watching Josie wrapped in a thick blanket, her shoulders trembling. Her tiny room was barely more than a pantry cold enough to freeze the breath. His room nearer the hearth was the warmest. The decision came quick and solid in his mind. He rose, tossed another log onto the flames, and turned toward her. "Mrs. Hale," he said, voice rough from disuse. She looked up, startled. "Mr. Reddick." "It's too cold," he said simply. "That kitchen wall lets the wind straight through. You'll take my room tonight." Her eyes widened, disbelief flashing across her face. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." "I'm fine," Josie said softly. "I'm not asking, Colt." Reddick replied, his voice firm as granite. "It's warmer in there. You take the bed." "I'll be fine in the barn," he added, tone flat, stripped of sentiment. "Plenty of hay." She opened her mouth to protest, but the hard line of his jaw ended the discussion. All she could do was nod, a mix of disbelief and gratitude flickering in her eyes. Colt gathered a couple of blankets and stepped outside without another word. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud that echoed through the stillness. Josie stood alone in the warm glow of the fire. Slowly, she walked to the door of his room. Her hand hesitated before she pushed it open. The space was plain masculine. A faint scent of leather wood smoke and pine lingered in the air. The bed was large, covered in a patchwork quilt worn smooth by years of use. She stood there for a long while, letting the warmth sink into her bones. But it wasn't the heat that brought tears to her eyes, it was the gesture. A small act of kindness from a man who lived like the world had already broken him. It stirred something fragile in her, something she thought had long since died. In that room beneath the soft flicker of firelight, Josie Hale wept, not for the horrors she'd endured, but for the tiny stubborn spark of hope he'd unknowingly rekindled in her chest. Winter finally yielded its hold on the land. The snow melted into patchy scars across the fields, and the first breath of spring crept through the air. The wind no longer cut like a blade. It carried the scent of damp soil and the promise of life. Little bursts of wild flowers, purple, yellow, white, dotted the hills, defying the ghosts of winter's cruelty. That slow awakening mirrored the change inside Josie. The routine she and Colt had built, shared meals, quiet glances, the hush of evenings by the fire, had become her shelter. The silence between them had turned companionable, no longer empty, but filled with something she couldn't quite name. The memory of his quiet kindness glowed like an ember she carefully tended. Her grief hadn't vanished, but cracks had begun to form in its shell. Through them, the first shoots of something living began to push. Then, on a bright April morning, that fragile peace shattered. Colt was near the corral, mending a fence post, the steady rhythm of his hammer echoing through the stillness. He caught sight of a dark speck on the horizon, a wagon kicking up dust as it rattled down the trail toward the ranch. Not the stagecoach. Not expected. Visitors were rare out here, and rarely meant good news. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, eyes narrowing as the wagon drew closer. A woman sat in the passenger seat beside the driver, bright against the muted land. Her dress was the color of wild roses, too fine, too city-like for Wyoming soil. A straw bonnet trimmed with silk shaded her face. When the wagon stopped, she stood, and the morning sun caught her hair, It gleamed like spun gold. Colt's breath caught before he could stop it. She was young, vibrant, radiant in a way that seemed almost out of place here. Her figure was soft, her smile confident and practiced. The kitchen door creaked open behind him. Josie stepped onto the porch, brushing flour from her hands. Her brow furrowed at the sight of the stranger, but when her eyes found the woman stepping down from the wagon, all color drained from her face. The wooden spoon slipped from her hand, clattering on the boards. Willa Josie's voice cracked like dry timber. The blonde woman's smile brightened dazzling. "Josie, my dear sister, I've found you at last." She moved gracefully, sweeping Josie into her arms. But Josie remained stiff, unmoving dread coursing through her veins. Willa Hart, the one person who knew all her secrets, all her shame, the one she'd hoped to never face again. Colt approached Hammer still in hand, feeling like he'd stumbled into someone else's story. Willa pulled back, eyes bright as summer sky. Then she turned them on him. The full force of her charm hit like a sudden gust. "You must be Mr. Reddick," she said, her voice a velvet purr. "Josie wrote about your kindness. I'm Willa, her younger sister. I owe you more than I could ever repay for taking her in." She extended a gloved hand. Colt shifted his hammer awkwardly, taking her hand in his rough one. Her skin was soft, her grip surprisingly firm. "Ma'am," he managed, feeling clumsy and unrefined. Over lunch, Willa told her tale with the polish of a performer. She spoke of their father's death, of losing everything, and how she'd been forced into marriage with a wealthy but cruel old man in St. Louis, a man who'd treated her like a possession. He was not a kind man, Willa said, lowering her lashes just enough to seem fragile. He thought love was ownership. She glanced at Colt meaningfully. Then came her grand escape, fleeing under the cover of night penniless, but determined to find her only family. "I just wanted to be with my sister," she finished softly. Josie sat silent, her hands trembling in her lap, a storm brewing behind her calm eyes. Willa finished her tale, her voice trembling just enough to seem sincere. She reached across the table, laying her delicate hand over Josie's. "We're all that's left, sister. Just you and me now." Josie didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the worn grain of the table, tracing it with her thumb, as if the story had carved something raw into her. She knew her sister's ways, how truth and fiction bled together when Willa spoke. Their father had died, yes, and they'd been left with nothing. Willa had indeed married an older man, but forced was not the word Josie would have used. She remembered those letters from St. Louis, full of talk about satin gowns, champagne, and dances under chandelier light. This version of escape and desperation felt rehearsed, but calling her out would mean dragging their shame into daylight in front of Colt Reddick. The man who'd taken her in, given her shelter, treated her with decency. So Josie bit her tongue and stayed silent, a prisoner to her past and to gratitude. Colt, however, was a man who took people at face value. Her story cut straight through his defenses. He saw only a young woman who'd fled cruelty, a survivor clinging to family. His heart softened as he looked at Willa's tear-streaked face, at her fragile beauty framed by firelight. "You're welcome here, Miss Willa," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Stay as long as you need. Family ought to be together." Willa's smile bloomed like a rose in spring. "Thank you, Mr. Reddick. You're a good man." Her eyes lingered on his longer than they should have, soft, searching, and unsettlingly warm. From that day on, the cabin felt different. Willa brought with her laughter, bright lilting, filling the corners Josie had once kept quiet. She insisted on helping with chores, though she left more chaos in the kitchen than order. When she needed something, it was always Colt she called for her tone, sweet and helpless, her eyes wide in mock innocence. Josie worked in silence, watching her sister orbit Colt like a moth drawn to flame. Willa flattered him constantly, asking about his ranch work, his tools, the storms he'd weathered, as if each word from his mouth were gospel. She praised his grit, his strength, his way of carving a life from dust and rock. And she was careful. Always careful. A hand brushing his arm as she passed behind him. A glance held a breath too long. At dinner, she leaned close to hear him better, the shawl slipping from her shoulder to bare a smooth curve of skin. She would feign embarrassment, pulling it back in place with a shy little smile that said the opposite. Her eyes were her true weapon. They followed him when she thought no one noticed, full of unspoken promises. And when Colt caught her looking, she didn't look away. That quiet tension thickened the air between them. Josie saw it all, helpless, heart-sick, silent. The small sanctuary she'd built began to crumble. The cabin that had once felt like safety now felt like a stage, and Willa was commanding it. Colt was changing. His guarded nature eased around Willa. The lines around his eyes softened when she laughed. He talked more at supper, drawn out by her questions and admiration. One night, Colt made a dry joke about one of his stubborn mules. Willa's laughter, rich, melodic, genuine, filled the room, and for the first time, Josie saw him smile. A real smile. The kind she'd never been able to summon from him. The sight hit her like a punch to the chest. She was the shadow. Willa was the sun. Broken things like her didn't stand beside men like him. Not when the world offered something so bright, so alive. Jealousy, shame, and guilt warred inside her, but she said nothing. Colt had given her a home. Willa was her blood. To complain would make her seem petty, ungrateful, small. And so the silence deepened. One evening they gathered in the main room. The fire crackled softly. Colt sat at the table cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks breaking the hush. Josie mended a shirt, each stitch tight, and small her heart wound just as taut. Willa reclined in the chair nearest the fire, a book open but unread in her lap. The flames painted her skin in gold and shadow. Sleep tugged at her, her head tilting to one side. Her golden hair shimmered in the firelight, and her nightgown, thin pale cotton, finer than anything Josie owned, clung softly to her form. Josie's gaze flicked to Colt. His hands had stilled. The rifle lay across his knees, forgotten. He was staring at Willa, something unreadable in his eyes, a mix of confusion and something else. Something Josie didn't dare name. Willa, Josie said quietly. No response. Colt cleared his throat. She'll catch her death out here. He stood crossed the room and laid a hand on Willa's shoulder. Miss Willa, she murmured softly, curling deeper into the chair. The motion made the strap of her gown slip from her shoulder, exposing skin smooth and pale as ivory. Colt's hand jerked back as though burned. He turned to Josie. Face-flushed eyes wide with panic and shame. He looked trapped, torn between decency and duty. Leaving her there felt cruel. Touching her felt like sin. He let out a slow, defeated breath, shoulders sinking as he made his decision. He slipped an arm beneath Willa's knees, the other behind her back, and lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. Her head fell softly against his shoulder, a sigh escaping her lips, content, unguarded, oblivious. For a moment, Colt Reddick stood frozen, caught between decency and desire, the scent of lavender in her hair stirring something dangerous deep inside him. Her warmth against his chest was a shock, soft, fragile, alive. It had been 5 long, empty years since he'd felt the weight of a woman in his arms. The jolt of it hit him like lightning, half terror, half temptation. He carried her to the small room she shared with Josie and laid her gently on the cot. The motion was awkward, mechanical, his jaw clenched tight, as if the restraint alone held his soul together. He pulled the blanket over her and left quickly like a man fleeing from his own weakness. Josie heard his boots on the porch, then the barn door creaking open against the wind. She knew he'd chosen the cold over the nearness of her sister. The fire popped in the hearth, but she felt no warmth, only the ache of something breaking inside her. The next morning, Willa found Colt in the barn sharpening an axe. She carried a cup of coffee, her steps deliberate, her face arranged in concern. "Mr. Reddick," she said softly, "do you have a moment?" He paused, wary. "Go on." "It's about Josie," she murmured. "I worry for her. She seems fine, I know, but the truth is she's not. That fire took more than her home. It burned the joy out of her." She set the cup on a crate, lowering her lashes. "Sometimes I think she's forgotten how to feel at all." Then, after a beat, her voice dropped to a near whisper. "I remember you from years back, in town, buying supplies with your father. I thought even then you looked strong, a man who knew who he was." She stepped closer, her tone turning intimate, almost confessional. "My sister's a good woman, Mr. Reddick. Kind honest. But she doesn't understand men like you. She doesn't understand what a man needs or what a woman truly wants." Her words were honeyed poison, painting Josie as cold and unreachable while casting herself in the warm light of understanding. Colt said nothing, but his pulse betrayed him. A few nights later, the line between them blurred further. He'd traded a neighbor for a small sack of oranges, a rare luxury. After supper, he sat on the porch, peeling one, the sharp citrus mingling with the cool evening air. Willa joined him on the steps, her chatter bright and careless, her laughter a melody meant for him alone. Josie stood in the doorway, silent, watching. Colt offered Willa a slice. Their fingers brushed. She took it slowly, her gaze never leaving his face. When she smiled, it wasn't shy, it was knowing. An intimate, deliberate thing that left no doubt of her intent. He smiled back, just a faint, private curve of his lips. But it was enough. Josie saw it, and in that moment the small ember of hope she'd been keeping alive finally went out. The next morning she moved like a ghost. She took her meals alone in the kitchen before they sat to eat. Her words grew shorter, her voice distant, her eyes hollow. She built her silence into armor, burying herself in chores, scrubbing, mending, baking, sweeping, each task a brick in the wall she was raising around her heart. At dawn, she gathered her few belongings, a spare dress, a brush, her mother's worn Bible, and carried them across the yard to the barn. The air smelled of hay and horse, warm and dusty. She climbed the ladder to the loft and made herself a nest in the hay, her small hands trembling as she arranged a blanket over the hollow she'd carved. That evening, when Willa found her there, she spoke with practiced concern. "Josie, this is madness. Why would you sleep out here?" "The room's too small for two," Josie answered quietly. "You need your space." "I'm fine here. It's warm enough." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was also surrender, quiet, complete, and final. Josie was yielding the hearth, the kitchen, the heart of the house, to her sister. She would be what she'd once been when she arrived a servant in her own life. Colt noticed immediately. That night when he came in for supper, the table was set for two. Josie served the food, then carried her plate to the kitchen without a word. He almost called after her. Almost. But one glance at Willa's calm, smiling face stopped him. To question Josie's absence would mean opening a door he wasn't ready to face. So he sat in the uneasy quiet, while Willa's laughter filled the empty spaces where Josie's silence used to live. It was noise without warmth, like feathers falling into a canyon, pretty soft and endlessly hollow. Willa's laughter, once a melody that had seemed to chase away the loneliness, now grated against Colt Reddick's nerves, like the scrape of a knife on stone. There was a brittle sharpness to it, an edge too bright to be real. Her tales of suffering in St. Louis had begun to sound like lines from a well-rehearsed play, each retelling more polished than the last. He felt the emptiness more acutely now than ever. He missed Josie's quiet presence at the table, the calm, grounding way she listened without judgment, her stillness that had softened the noise inside him. Her silence had been something he could lean into, steady and deep, like water smoothing over rock. Without her, dinner was just food. The house, just timber and nails. The warmth was gone, and in its place sat a hollow ache he couldn't name. He found himself straining for her sounds, the faint clink of a dish, the rustle of skirts from the kitchen, anything that reminded him she was still there. And Willa, with her predatory intuition, noticed. She saw his eyes flick toward the kitchen door, the small furrow in his brow, when her laughter rang a little too loudly. She sensed the shift in him, the soft pull that still tied him to Josie, and it unsettled her. To Willa, Josie's retreat wasn't a loss. It was a challenge, a dangerous kind. She'd have to fight harder now, win him with charm, with stories, with her own body if she must. So she began weaving tales spun from half-truths and false memories. "Do you remember Mr. Reddick?" She'd ask, her voice soft, nostalgic. "At the summer fair years ago, you won the log-splitting contest. I was just a little girl, but I thought you were the strongest man alive." He frowned vaguely, recalling the contest, but no golden-haired child at the edge of the crowd. Still, her words painted a picture too innocent to question. Her accidental touches became bolder. While clearing the table, her fingers lingered on his shoulder. When she brought him water on the porch, her fingertips traced his knuckles as he took the glass. Each brush of skin was deliberate, tiny sparks, feeding a fire he didn't want, but couldn't entirely ignore. And in her eyes he saw that desperate plea, "See me, want me, don't leave me alone again." It was emotional blackmail wrapped in perfume and silk. And Colt, a man unskilled in manipulation, was caught fast in her snare, unable to step back without seeming cruel. The night it all came to a breaking point, the air itself felt charged, thick, restless, the kind of stillness that warned of a storm. Colt stood on the porch, leaning against a post, staring toward the horizon where heat lightning flickered in the distance. He heard her footsteps before she spoke. "Heavy night," Willa murmured, her voice low, carrying the faint lilt of suggestion. She came to stand beside him, close enough that the lavender on her skin wrapped around him like a spell. "A storm's coming," he said, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "Sometimes a storm's a good thing," she whispered. "It clears the air." He didn't answer. Weariness pressed down on him like the heat itself. He missed the quiet, the peace that had once filled this place when Josie was near. He felt trapped by duty, by loneliness, by the memory of a promise made to a dead man. Then Willa turned toward him, her hand resting flat against his chest. He could feel her pulse through the thin fabric of his shirt. "Colt," she said softly, his name rolling from her lips for the first time, trembling with hunger and intent. Before he could move, she rose onto her toes and kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't tender. It was desperate, an attempt to claim him, to stake her place once and for all. For a few heartbeats, he was frozen. His body remembered the nearness of a woman, the warmth, the softness, but his mind recoiled. He didn't kiss her back. His arms stayed at his sides, rigid as the porch post behind him. He was stone, and her passion broke against him like a wave. From the shadows near the barn, Josie saw everything. She had stepped out for air, hoping to quiet her restless heart. The lightning lit the porch, and there they were, her sister's hand on his chest, her lips pressed to his. Josie didn't see his stillness, his lack of response. She saw only the shape of the moment, the confirmation of her worst fear. She turned away, her breath catching in her throat, fleeing into the dark barn like a wounded animal. Her heart thudded heavy as iron, her vision blurred with silent tears. There was no more room for doubt, no more space for foolish hope. She was the intruder now, the ghost haunting a life that no longer had a place for her. In that instant, her mind cleared with chilling resolve. She was the problem. She was standing in the way of her sister's happiness, of Colt's peace. And so, she made her decision. She would go, vanish without a trace. It was the only kindness she could still offer. By the time the house went dark, the first raindrops had started to fall soft at first, then steady, relentless. The sky split open and the storm came down hard, as if to wash her away completely. The wind howled through the eaves of the barn like a living thing, wild and merciless. Under that furious sky, Josie Hale worked by the flicker of a lantern, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the pencil. On a torn scrap of ledger paper, she scrawled her note, each letter blurred by rain and tears. When it was done, she pulled her shawl tight, stepped out into the storm, and crossed the yard. The mud sucked at her boots, the rain lashing her face. She slipped the folded note under the door of the main house and stood for one fleeting heartbeat, drenched and shaking. Then she turned away. Back inside the barn, her movements became quick and certain. She saddled Whisper, the gentlest, steadiest horse Colt Reddick owned. Her fingers clumsy but resolute as she fastened the cinch and gathered the reins. She whispered a soft apology to the mare, then pulled herself into the saddle with a grim determination that left no room for second thoughts. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The small cabin behind her, glowing faintly through the rain, would break her resolve if she saw it. So she turned Whisper toward the open plains, the black, rain-swollen void, and rode into it. The world was chaos. Sheets of water blurred the horizon. The trail had turned into a river of mud, slick and treacherous. Whisper pushed on hooves, sucking against the ground, head bowed low, each step a battle against the storm. Then came the sound, a long, mournful howl cutting through the wind, answered by another farther off. Wolves. Normally it was just another song of the night, but now it struck her like a blade of ice to the heart. She was alone, exposed, a fragile scrap of life, swallowed by a wilderness full of teeth. Panic took her. She urged Whisper faster, her fear outrunning her caution. It was a fatal mistake. The horse slipped on a hidden rock in a rain-filled gully. With a scream, Whisper went down, Josie thrown hard into the mud. Pain exploded through her body, a sharp crack in her leg, followed by a wave of white-hot agony. The world tilted the storm, spinning into a blur of light and noise. She tried to rise, but her leg buckled beneath her, twisted and useless. She collapsed again, a cry breaking free of her throat, swallowed instantly by the wind. The rain came harder. Her dress clung to her skin, the mud soaking cold into her bones. Somewhere out in the dark, the wolves howled again, closer this time. Much closer. Back at the ranch, Colt sat in his room, sleepless and hollow. The kiss had left him shaken, his soul raw with shame and confusion. Willa's touch lingered like a stain he couldn't scrub off, and the quiet of the storm only magnified his regret. Near midnight, restless and uneasy, he rose to check the doors. The wind rattled the shutters, and when he stooped to pick up a scrap of paper by the threshold, damp and curling from the rain, his heart stopped. Under the lamplight, he read Josie's neat, steady handwriting, Mr. Reddick. "Please don't be angry. I'm leaving because it's right. My sister deserves happiness. She deserves you. I've only ever been a shadow, a reminder of grief you never asked to carry. I was never brave enough to fight for joy, and I will not stand in her way. Take care of her. And of yourself. You are released from your promise to my husband. You've done more than enough. Gratefully, Josie Hale." He read it again and again, the ink running as his eyes blurred. Every word cut deeper than the last. The fog of foolishness, the strange pull he'd felt toward Willa, all of it, shattered beneath the brutal clarity of Josie's letter. A shadow numb. She was the light, the quiet, steadfast heart that had held his world together without a word. Willa was the illusion, the flicker of false warmth before darkness. Dread hit him like a bullet. He saw it all now. The empty stall, the storm outside, and his chest constricted until he could barely breathe. He'd been a fool, blind and selfish, and now she was gone. Josie. The name tore from his throat, raw and desperate. He grabbed his coat, slung his rifle across his shoulder, and stormed out into the black. Rain hit him like fists. The wind clawed at his coat, at his breath, but he didn't stop. He stumbled through the mud toward the barn, heart hammering, praying he was wrong. But the empty stall told the truth. Whisper was gone. He froze the truth, slicing through him sharper than the wind. She was out there hurt, or worse, alone in the wild. And it was his fault. Josie. He roared again, his voice vanishing into the storm. The lantern light swung wildly in his grasp, its circle of gold slicing through sheets of rain. He pushed forward, half blind, guided only by instinct and terror. The plains stretched before him, endless and dark, the mud trying to drag him down with every step. But he kept going, calling her name into the storm, until his throat burned raw, and the night swallowed his voice whole. He'd chased after many things in his life. Cattle storms, ghosts, but never something this vital, this sacred. He wasn't chasing a woman now. He was chasing the only piece of his soul that had ever felt like home. Josie Colt Reddick's voice tore through the storm, raw and ragged, each shout swallowed by the wind. His throat burned, his lungs heaved, and still he called her name like a prayer that might bend heaven itself. He didn't know how long he'd been searching, an hour, or maybe an eternity. The rain had drenched him through to the bone, the mud clung to his boots like chains, and despair pressed in hard on his chest. Then, by some mercy, the lantern light caught a disturbance in the earth, a churned patch of mud, deep and chaotic. He stumbled toward it, heart hammering. The shape that emerged from the darkness made him stop dead. Whisper. The mare lay in the muck, her leg twisted at a sickening angle, her breath shallow and rattling. Still alive, but barely. Colt's gut clenched, as if gripped by ice. He lifted the lantern higher, its trembling light slicing through the sheets of rain, searching. That's when he saw her. A few yards away, half submerged in mud and rainwater, Josie lay motionless. She looked impossibly small, like a broken doll, abandoned in the storm. Her hair was plastered to her pale face, her dress torn, her body limp. One leg was bent at an angle that made his stomach turn. For one paralyzing moment, he thought she was gone. He dropped to his knees, mud splashing around him, and pressed his shaking fingers against her neck. Nothing. Then there it was. A pulse. Weak. But there, a sound ripped from him somewhere between a sob and a growl of relief. She was alive. Barely, but alive. He knew there was no saving Whisper. The realization cut through him sharp and cruel, but Josie came first. She was all that mattered now. Moving with desperate gentleness, Colt slid his arms beneath her, one under her back, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her. She was so light, frighteningly so, her body cold against his soaked shirt. She let out a small, broken moan as he rose to his feet, and the sound nearly undid him. "I've got you, Josie," he murmured, his voice trembling. "You're safe now. I'm taking you home." The trek back was agony. Every step was a battle against the wind, the rain, and the weight of guilt crushing his chest. He turned his back to the gale, shielding her from the storm, with his own body, the lantern swinging wildly from his wrist. Her leg was bent wrong beneath the blanket of her skirts, and each time he stumbled, he felt her shudder against him. But he kept his eyes locked on the faint golden glow ahead the cabin window, his single thread of hope in the endless dark. By the time he reached the porch, his strength was nearly gone. He kicked the door open and staggered inside, rain and wind roaring in with him. Willa Hart stood by the hearth, her face pale, her arms hugging her sides. When she saw the unconscious, mud-caked woman in Colt's arms, her breath caught. All her charm, her pretense, her practiced sweetness gone. What stared back at him was naked horror. She saw her sister broken near death, and she saw the look on Colt's face. That raw, helpless, fierce love, the kind that left no room for anyone else. Blankets, Colt rasped. Hot water. Now. Willa didn't hesitate. She flew into motion as he carried Josie to his own room, the only one warm enough to keep her alive, and laid her on his bed with reverent care. The next hours blurred into frantic work. Colt barked orders, and Willa obeyed, fear and guilt guiding her hands. He cut away the soaked dress from Josie's injured leg. The sight made him pale. The bone had snapped clean above the ankle, the flesh swelling grotesquely around it. He swallowed hard, steadied himself, and did what had to be done. With one firm pull, he reset the bone. Josie's body arched a cry of pain tearing from her lips before she fell back into merciful unconsciousness. The sound would haunt him for years. He splinted the leg as best he could with strips of wood and torn fabric, then washed the mud and blood from her skin, his hands rough from ranch work moving with impossible tenderness. For 3 days and nights, Colt never left her side. He fed her spoonfuls of broth, wiped her fevered brow, and kept the fire burning hot and steady. When exhaustion overtook him, he'd nod forward in the chair by her bed, only to wake at the faintest sound and start again. Willa stood in the doorway, silent as a ghost. She watched the man she thought she'd known, the stoic, guarded rancher, become something entirely different. Every touch he gave Josie was filled with patience, devotion, love so deep it was painful to witness. She watched him smooth the hair from Josie's forehead, whispering soft words meant only for her. "You're safe now. I'm here. You're home." Something broke inside Willa then. All her life she had believed love was a game, something to win through beauty, charm, and cunning. But this, what she was seeing now, wasn't a game at all. It was raw, unshakable, and real. She looked at Colt's tired, unshaven face, the hollow under his eyes, the firelight reflecting in the devotion written across his every move, and she understood finally terribly that she had never stood a chance. Her smiles, her flirtations, her glittering words, they were only shadows trying to mimic sunlight. And as she stood there watching her sister breathe because of him, She felt the hollow ache of true loneliness for the first time in her life. Willa Hart had always believed she was the one shining brightly, but now she saw the truth. She'd only ever been standing in the glow of their fire, mistaking its warmth for her own. By the fourth morning, the fever finally broke. Josie Hale's eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment she didn't know where or even who she was. The room was dim, lit only by the soft orange glow of the dying fire. Her head swam with fragments of storm and pain, the echo of wolves the cold. Then her eyes found him. Colt Reddick sat slumped in the chair beside her bed. His broad shoulders bowed under exhaustion, his face lined with sleepless nights. His chin rested against his chest, a shadow of stubble dark against his skin. Something in the sight of him, this silent guardian who hadn't left her side, cracked her heart wide open. The memories hit like a flood, the storm, the fall, the rain, the fear. Shame followed close behind. She'd been reckless, foolish. A burden. She tried to push herself up, but pain shot through her leg like fire, and a small cry escaped her lips. Colt was awake in an instant. "Josie." He breathed, voice hoarse from days of silence and worry. "You're awake. I'm sorry," she whispered, her throat dry and raw. The horse, he shook his head gently. "Hush now. Don't you worry about that. Just rest." He lifted a cup of water to her lips, steadying it with a hand that trembled only slightly. She drank, her eyes fixed on him. She saw the dark circles beneath his eyes, the exhaustion etched into his features, and her heart twisted with guilt, and something deeper, something dangerously close to love. She tried to pull her hand back, embarrassed by her weakness, but he didn't let go. His rough, work-worn fingers closed gently around hers, grounding her. Then he did something that stole her breath completely. Colt dropped to his knees beside the bed. This strong, stoic man, now kneeling before her, looked suddenly human in a way that made her chest ache. He took her hand in both of his thumb tracing small circles over her knuckles, his gaze locked on hers. "Josie," he said quietly, his voice rough, low, trembling. "When I found that note, when I thought you were gone, I thought I'd lost my soul right along with you." He paused, swallowing hard, the words dragging up from someplace deep. "All these years I've been scared to feel anything again, scared that if I did, I'd lose it too. But I see it now. What's worse than losing love is never letting yourself feel it at all." Her breath caught, and he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a trembling kiss against it. "Willa told me once that a man has needs, that I'd been missing out." He shook his head slowly, his voice breaking into something raw and clear. "But I don't want what I missed. Josie, I'm terrified of losing what I've found." Her eyes filled instantly, tears spilling down her cheeks, not from pain or sorrow, but from the kind of release that comes when a heart finally stops fighting. All her loneliness, all her fear, all her doubt melted in that single, shattering moment. This man, this quiet, stubborn, honorable man, loved her. He leaned in, hesitating just long enough for her to give the smallest nod, a breath of permission. And then his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of hunger or conquest. It was home. It carried years of grief and a dawning, trembling hope. It was soft at first, like a prayer, then deepened into something that spoke of healing, of two broken souls stitching each other back together. The fire crackled softly beside them, casting their shadows against the wall. Two lives finally converging in the smallest, most human of miracles. Out in the hallway, Willa Hart had been walking toward the kitchen when she heard their voices. She froze, her hand tightening against the doorframe. Colt's voice came through, rough, unguarded, full of truth, and she couldn't move. When the soft sound of laughter drifted out a moment later, low tender shared something inside her, shattered, but not in anger. The tears that came were not bitter. They were clean, sharp, and strangely freeing. For the first time, she wept, not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd finally understood. At dawn, when the storm-burnished land outside gleamed under the sun, Willa packed her small bag in silence. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She took one last look around the room, then went to Colt's door. Inside, Josie was propped against her pillows, her color returning her eyes soft and alive. Colt sat beside her, his hand wrapped gently around hers. When they looked up, Willa stood framed in the doorway, her face composed, but her voice steady. "I'm leaving," she said quietly. "Stage stops by in an hour. I'll walk to the road." Josie's eyes widened. "Willa, no. Where will you go?" "I don't know," she admitted, her lips trembling in a faint smile. "But I can't stay. This is your home." Her gaze flicked between them, and something like peace crossed her face. "I hope you'll both be happy." She turned to leave, but Josie's voice stopped her. "Wait." Willa turned back. "Don't go," Josie pleaded softly, reaching out her hand. "Please. I let so much slip away after Father died. I forgot how to hold on to family. But you're my blood, Willa. You're all I have left." For a moment, neither moved. Then Willa's lips parted, her eyes glistening. All her vanity, all her pride, all the lies she'd lived behind fell away like ashes. What was left was simple and real. Two sisters, bruised, but still bound by something stronger than envy or shame. Colt watched in silence, his throat tight. As Willa took her sister's hand, something stirred inside him, a quiet reverence for Josie's grace, her compassion. He had thought he'd found love in her, but in that moment, watching her reach for forgiveness, he realized he'd found something even rarer: redemption. Colt Reddick looked from Willa Hart to Josie Hale, two women bound by blood and loss, each carrying her own scars. What he saw wasn't rivalry anymore, nor shame or resentment. He saw survivors wounded, yes, but still standing. He rose slowly from his chair, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He walked to where Willa stood frozen in the doorway and took her gently by the arm. Without a word, he guided her closer to the bed until she stood beside Josie. Then he placed a hand on each of their shoulders, one firm, one tender. His voice was low but steady, heavy with a kind of worn wisdom. "We're all cracked somewhere," he said quietly. "Chasing things that never fit us, running from the things that might." He drew a breath, his eyes softening. "I don't know what the world will think, and right now, I don't give a damn. This land's wide enough, this house big enough. We can make something like family here, if we've got the heart to keep it." And so the days that followed Josie's recovery bloomed into something tender, a fragile autumn of healing that settled over the ranch like a benediction. The question of Willa's departure was never raised again. Her presence simply became part of the rhythm of life at the Reddick place, as natural and necessary as the creek that ran behind the barn or the cottonwoods that whispered in the wind. Josie, still walking with the faintest limp, returned to the kitchen, the true heart of their home. But it was different now. The frantic energy of survival had given way to peace. She cooked not out of duty, but out of quiet joy. Bread baked golden in the oven, filling the cabin with warmth and scent. Stew simmered rich and slow, the kind that could melt the edge off a hard day. And sometimes, when she thought no one was listening, she hummed old songs that drifted through the rafters like ghosts, finally at rest. Willa, to everyone's surprise, including her own, found her salvation in the earth. The scrappy patch of soil Josie once tended became Willa's domain. She worked it with fierce, almost joyful determination, her fancy dresses traded for denim and cotton, her manicured hands hardened and brown from sun and soil. She planted beans, squash, tomatoes, life bursting from the stubborn ground. Wildflowers climbed the fence line in a riot of color, softening the edges of the weathered homestead. And when she looked at what she'd made, she found a peace no party in St. Louis had ever given her. Colt threw himself into work, his days marked by the rhythmic sound of hammer on nail. He mended fences torn by winter storms, raised new corrals, and worked the cattle with a steady, quiet energy. But his labor wasn't the lonely kind anymore. He worked for them, for something that felt whole. They lived like a family without needing to name it. The bond between Colt and Josie was deep and unspoken. Less fire, more foundation. Love built not from desire, but from endurance, gratitude, and the shared ache of surviving. It showed in the way his hand would find hers under the table, or in the way her voice softened when she said his name. It lived in their quiet laughter, on the porch at night, the two of them talking low after Willa had gone to bed. Between Colt and Willa, a new kind of understanding grew, one stripped clean of the old tension. The flirtation had burned away in the fire of Josie's near death. What remained was something lighter, an easy teasing friendship. She'd poke fun at his stoicism, and he'd answer with that dry wit that always made her laugh. He no longer saw her as temptation. She was simply life, vivid, impulsive, warm. And she at last saw him not as a man to win, but as the man who'd saved her sister's heart. The sisters, too, found their way back to each other. They worked side by side, shelling peas, canning vegetables, trading quiet stories of the past, and cautious hopes for the future. Willa's laughter, once sharp, now came softer, and Josie's smile, rare, steady, real, would appear more often when her sister was near. They were finally truly sisters again. In the evenings, the three of them would gather on the porch. Josie and Willa in their chairs, Colt sitting on the top step, his back against the post. Together they'd watch the sun dip behind the distant hills, painting the Wyoming sky in molten gold and violet. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. The silence was warm and full, a kind of quiet that felt like grace. For those few precious months, they weren't a widow, a rancher, and a runaway sister. They were simply three broken hearts, learning somehow to beat in time. But peace on the prairie never lasts forever. The world beyond their fence still turned, and the world had rules. Rules that didn't take kindly to the strange little family on Reddick land. The whispers started small, carried by the same wind that swept through the Bitter Creek Valley. Colt felt it first during his Saturday supply run to town. When he stepped into Buck Hanley's general store, conversation went quiet. The women gathered near the sugar barrels pulled their children close, eyes tight with disapproval. The men outside by the saloon glanced his way. Their smirks mean their whispers, sharp as spurs. And when the circuit preacher rode in the tall, thin one, with the cold, measuring eyes, things got worse. Pastor Hale's sermons could slice a man to ribbons without ever raising his voice. And this time he'd come looking for sin, hiding under a good man's roof. Pastor Hale came rolling in one Sunday afternoon, his buggy trailing a dusty halo down the long road that led to the Reddick ranch. He said he was making his usual rounds, checking on the spiritual welfare of his flock, scattered across the Bitter Creek Valley. But Colt could see the real reason in his eyes before the man even opened his mouth. Inside the small cabin, Hale sat stiff-backed in a chair, a cup of Josie Hale's tea clutched like a prop in his bony hands. His narrow eyes took in everything: the swept floor, the tidy shelves, the vase of wildflowers. Willa Hart had set on the mantel, like a man taking inventory of sin. He began with polite words, the kind that felt too sharp around the edges. "It warms my heart to see you on your feet again, Mrs. Hale," he said, voice dry as dust. "And reunited with your sister, no less. Family is one of the Lord's greatest gifts. We feel very blessed," Reverend Josie answered quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Pastor Hale's gaze shifted toward Colt. "And it speaks highly of your Christian charity, Mr. Reddick, to offer your home to 2 women in need." "I did what any man ought to," Colt said evenly, his tone flat as a shovel blade. He didn't like the preacher's eyes, sharp, prying things that seemed to strip a man down to bone. Hale took a delicate sip of tea, then set the cup down with a click that sounded far too deliberate. "Indeed," he said. "However, the town has concerns. Folks are talking." Josie's fingers tightened in her lap. "It's an unusual arrangement," Hale continued, his voice low but cutting. "A single man living under the same roof as 2 unmarried women. People are beginning to wonder what sort of example is being set for the rest of Bitter Creek." Willa, who'd been sitting near the fire with her jaw tight, finally snapped. "We are a family, Reverend," she said sharply. "We take care of each other." "Does the Lord frown on that too?" The preacher's lips pinched thin. His gaze turned icy as he looked her over. "The Lord calls us to avoid the appearance of sin, Miss Hart," he replied coolly. "A woman of striking presence, such as yourself living so closely with a man, not your husband, it tempts weaker souls." The insult hit the room like a slap. The implication hung heavy, poisonous. Colt's fists clenched. His jaw tightened. He could hear the blood rush in his ears. Pastor Hale turned back to Josie. "And you, Mrs. Hale, widow, elder sister, supposed example of virtue, allowing this situation to continue." He shook his head solemnly. "It shows a troubling lack of judgment. A failure of moral duty." Josie flinched, color draining from her face. In that moment, the preacher gave voice to what the whole town had been whispering, that Willa was a temptress, Josie a weak fool, and Colt Reddick a godless man, corrupting them both. When Pastor Hale left, the door seemed to carry a chill that the fire couldn't drive away. The silence afterward was heavy, brittle. From that day on, the whispers turned into open condemnation. During the next trip to town, the truth of it hit like stones. A pack of children pointed at Willa as she stepped off the wagon, one shouting Jezebel before being yanked away by his mother. At the general store, Henrietta Crow, Buck Hanley's sharp-tongued wife, cornered Josie near the barrels of flour. "You should be ashamed," she hissed. "Letting your own sister behave like that, parading around as if she's a lady. You disgrace your husband's memory." Josie stood frozen, unable to speak. The walls of gossip closed in tighter each day. Trips to town became rare and heavy with dread. The air on the ranch, once peaceful, grew taut with unease, the quiet between them threaded with the fear of what might come next. Then one moonless night, near the end of summer, the world outside turned hostile. They were gathered inside the lamplight, soft and golden, wrapping them in a fragile illusion of peace. Josie read aloud from her Bible, her voice a low murmur. Willa sat near the fire, mending one of Colt's shirts. Colt worked a small carving knife, whittling a bird from a block of pine. For a little while, it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. Until the first crack. A sharp, echoing blow hit the outside wall. They froze. What was that? Willa whispered. Her needle paused in midair. Coyotes, maybe, Colt said, though even he didn't believe it. He rose slowly to his feet. The second sound was louder, the crash of shattering glass. A rock the size of a man's fist smashed through the window, scattering shards across the floor before landing with a dull thud near the hearth. Josie screamed. Willa dropped the shirt, heart hammering. Outside, voices broke the nightmen's laughter, ugly and drunk. "Come on out," Reddick, one slurred. "Share the wealth." Colt's face turned to thunder. He grabbed his rifle from the wall, but Josie caught his arm, panic in her eyes. "Colt, don't," she begged. "They're drunk. You'll only make it worse." Then came another sound, something wet splattering against the front door, followed by boot steps retreating into the darkness. A strong, acrid smell seeped into the room paint. For a long moment, no one moved. Only the clock ticked loud as a heartbeat. Then Colt set his jaw across the room and unbolted the door. In the light of the lantern, the words glared back at them, thick, uneven, dripping red across the rough wood. 3 people. 1 sin. The letters gleamed wet in the night air, a mark of hatred no rain could wash clean. The peace they'd built, fragile, hard-won, was gone in an instant. Their home, their refuge, had been branded a house of shame. And Josie, staring at the red scrawl, began to tremble so violently, Colt thought she might fall. Her face turned pale as linen. The world had finally come knocking, and it meant to break them. The terror that gripped Josie Hale that night wasn't new. It was the echo of another nightmare. Another night, when men's cruelty had shattered her sense of safety. Her hands trembled as she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain still dripping from the eaves. "We have to go, Colt. We have to leave this place," she said, clutching at his sleeve. "They won't stop until they've burned it all down." Her first instinct was always to run, to vanish before the world had another chance to wound her. But Willa Hart wasn't built for retreat anymore. Fury lit her from the inside out. Her eyes blazing like blue fire under the lamplight. She snatched the iron poker from beside the hearth, gripping it so tight her knuckles turned white. "Go," she snapped. "Not this time." Her voice rang through the room, strong and steady. "We're not running from a pack of drunk cowards with nothing better to do than spit on what they don't understand. Let them come, I'll be waiting." The girl who once fought with words and charm now stood ready to fight with iron and rage. And for the first time, Colt and Josie saw just how much steel had grown beneath her softness. Colt stood between them, silent and torn in two. Rage burned through him like wildfire, but his was the kind that smoldered deep, dangerous, restrained. He wanted to ride into Bitter Creek, drag those men from their beds, and make them pay for every hateful word they'd ever thrown. But he knew where that road ended, in blood, in more pain, in proof of everything Pastor Hale's sermon had whispered into the town's ear. No. Violence would only give them what they wanted, a reason to destroy him completely. He stayed silent, jaw tight, the muscles in his forearms knotted. "They're right." Josie choked, suddenly mistaking his quiet for agreement. "They're right about us, about what we've become." "Stop it!" Willa shouted, whirling on her. "They're wrong. There's nothing sinful under this roof." Josie's voice broke. "Then what are we, Willa? What would you call this?" The words hung sharp and heavy in the still air. For a moment, it wasn't the Bitter Creek folks outside tearing them apart. It was fear, shame, and grief doing it for them. Then Colt moved. He stepped forward, his face drawn tight with pain, and gathered both women into his arms. Josie crumpled against his chest, sobbing quietly, while Willa stood stiff for a heartbeat before her resistance broke, and she leaned into him trembling. The poker slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. He held them there, 3 broken souls in the half-light. His strength, the only thing keeping them from splintering completely. After a long silence, Colt lifted his head. His voice came low and raw, but steady as a heartbeat. "We're not wrong," he said, looking past them to the hateful words painted on their door. "There's no sin in this house," he continued, his voice deepening. "Because what we have here, it's love. And love ain't ever wrong." He looked from Josie's tear-streaked face to Willa's fierce one. "The world may call it what it wants, but I won't let its smallness define us." The words hung like iron in the air, simple, solid, unbreakable. When the dawn came, the red paint on the door was still there, ugly raw, but they no longer looked at it with shame. It wasn't a verdict anymore. It was a challenge. They wouldn't run. They wouldn't fight with fists or rifles. They'd fight by living, by standing tall, by refusing to be erased. The decision was wordless, a shared look between the 3 of them, a quiet nod that meant together. The next morning, Colt didn't scrub away the red letters. He left them bright and hateful as a reminder of what they stood against. Instead, he took a smooth plank of wood and carved with the same patient hands that mended fences and whittled dreams a new sign. When it was done, he hung it above the scarlet words. The letters were clean, strong, unshakable. The Reddick home. A claim, a defiance, a promise, and it was Josie who came up with the first act of defiance to follow. "Sunday dinner," she said one morning, her hands deep in bread dough, her tone calm but sure. "After Pastor Hale's service, we'll invite everyone from Bitter Creek." Willa nearly dropped her coffee. "Josie, are you out of your mind? They'll laugh in our faces or worse." "Let them," Josie said, kneading the dough with steady rhythm. "We'll feed them anyway. We'll meet their hate with kindness. We'll show them who we really are." And so they did. On Saturday, Colt rode into town, a stack of carefully written invitations tucked under his arm. He didn't hand them out with apology, just quiet, steady respect. Most folks gave him nothing in return but cold eyes and silence. 1 or 2 muttered a refusal. But he left an invitation at every door, a peace offering no one could claim they hadn't received. By Sunday morning, the house was alive with smells of roasting chicken and fresh bread. Josie's mended tablecloth stretched across the long, improvised table. Willa's wildflowers brightened the corners, and the garden's vegetables simmered in a pot that filled the room with warmth. They didn't expect anyone to come. It wasn't about that. The feast itself was their act of faith, proof to themselves that their dignity was still their own. Then, just as the sun climbed high and the smell of food drifted out across the fields, the crunch of wagon wheels broke the quiet. A single wagon rolled down the path, the Schmitz family, quiet German settlers who lived far beyond the ridge. Mr. Schmitz, broad and stoic, stepped down first, followed by Greta, his kind-eyed wife, and their 2 shy, tow-headed children clutching at her skirts. Colt stood frozen for a heartbeat, then smiled, small, tired, and genuine. Josie wiped her hands on her apron. "Set 2 more plates," she whispered to Willa, her eyes shining. And for the first time in a long while, the little ranch house didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home again. They never spoke of the sign on the door or the hateful words painted beneath it, but the Schmitz family's arrival said more than any sermon could. They were the only ones who came that Sunday. 5 people gathered around a table meant for 20, and yet somehow the small house felt full. Josie Hale served the food with steady hands, her grace unbroken despite the weight pressing against her chest. For a while they ate in silence, the kind that hums with uncertainty. Then Mr. Schmitz cleared his throat, muttered something approving through a mouthful of roast chicken, and Greta smiled shyly across the table. "These carrots," she said, her accent soft and heavy, "they taste like sunshine." Willa Hart flushed a small smile tugging at her lips. And when the Schmitz children, nervous at first, saw the kindness in Josie's and Willa's faces, they began to relax, quiet, giggles sneaking through the tension like the first drops of spring rain. By the end of the meal, it no longer felt like a test or an act of defiance. It was simply neighbors breaking bread. When the Schmitz family left, Greta pressed a jar of her own pickled beets into Josie's hands. "You are good people," she whispered. Her German vowels thick, her eyes glistening. It was a small crack in the wall of ice that surrounded the Reddick ranch, but a crack nonetheless. The real thaw came a week later in the middle of a stormy night. A pounding at the door jolted them from their sleep. Colt Reddick was on his feet before the second knock landed. When he swung the door open, the lantern light revealed Buck Hanley's face, ashen, panicked, drenched in sweat. His wife, Henrietta Crow, the same woman who'd once spat venom at Josie in town, stood behind him, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. "It's our boy Buck," choked out. "Tommy, he can't breathe. Doctor's gone out to Canyon Ridge, won't be back till Wednesday. We need medicine. Sheridan's the only one who's got it." Sheridan was 30 miles north. A hard, punishing ride through rough country, and the northern sky was already black with thunder. Colt didn't even think. "I'll go," he said, pulling on his boots. "I'm coming too," Willa said, her tone brooking no argument. She'd seen that kind of illness before, the desperate, rasping breaths of a child on the edge. "You'll need fresh horses halfway. I'll bring the spare." Before the Hanleys could protest, the two were gone, riding into a storm that howled like a living thing. Buck tried to stammer out his thanks, but Josie's calm voice cut through the chaos. "There's no time for that. Bring your boy inside," she said, already stoking the fire. "Your cabin's too cold and drafty. Here the air will stay warm." The Hanleys obeyed, dragging their small, gasping son into the same house they had once branded with shame. Josie cleared a space by the hearth and went to work, her movements sure and deliberate. She boiled water to fill the air with steam, brewed a tea of horehound and mullein from her own dried herbs, and pressed cool cloths against the boy's burning forehead. The small room filled with the hiss of boiling water and the low murmur of her voice, a voice steady enough to quiet fear itself. Henrietta, once proud and cruel, now clung to Josie's hand like a drowning woman, weeping without shame. The hours crawled by heavy with waiting. Just before dawn, thunder rolled over the ridge, and then the door burst open. Colt and Willa stumbled in, soaked to the bone, faces gray with exhaustion. Colt's saddlebag clinked with glass, the medicine. No one spoke. They moved as one. Colt held the boy's head steady while Josie measured out the dose, her hands trembling only once. Willa hovered close, whispering soft prayers into the storm-worn air. An hour later, the change came. The child's breathing eased, the harsh cough dulled. When his chest finally rose in slow, even rhythm, Henrietta let out a sound that was half sob, half prayer. She turned to them, all mud-caked, hollow-eyed, and radiant in the firelight. "We were wrong," she cried, tears spilling freely. "Lord help me, we were so wrong about you." By sunrise, word had already begun to spread, riding faster than any gossip ever had. No one could twist this story. No one could deny what the Reddick Ranch had done. When a child's life hung in the balance, they hadn't hesitated. They had ridden through a storm. They had opened their door. The whispers that once condemned them began to falter. A few days later, a young ranch hand came by one of the Hollow Ridge boys, likely part of that drunken mob months before. He didn't speak. He just laid a string of trout on the porch, nodded once, and left. It wasn't words he came to offer. It was an apology. Then others followed. Greta Schmidt returned for tea and stayed all afternoon swapping stories about gardens and weather. Old Man Peterson, a widower from down the valley, stopped by to ask Colt's advice about a sick calf and stayed long enough for Willa to hand him a slice of apple pie. He called it the best he'd ever had left with a handful of her wildflowers and said he'd be back to return the favor. They were small gestures, humble, hesitant, but real. For the first time in a long while, the Reddick home didn't feel like an island of shame. It felt like the heart of a growing circle, one built not on fear or gossip, but on something stronger: respect. The acceptance came quietly, not with fanfare, but with something gentler, something that felt like the world was finally exhaling. One bright autumn morning, when the air was cool and gold with harvest light, a young couple rode up the dirt path to the Reddick ranch. They couldn't have been much older than 20. The boy, nervous and polite, explained that he'd be marrying his sweetheart the next week, when Pastor Hale came through town, and he wondered if Colt Reddick, the steadiest hand in Bitter Creek, might give him a proper haircut for the occasion. Colt smiled, motioning for him to take a seat on the porch while he got the clippers. Willa Hart was out by the garden, her fingers buried in the rich soil as she tended to her flowers, and Josie Hale hummed softly as she pinned clean linens along the line, the breeze catching her hair like spun gold. The young couple looked around the quiet, sun-drenched homestead. After a while, the bride-to-be spoke up her voice, shy but certain. "Folks used to say strange things about this place," she said, glancing at the flowers, the chickens, the warm smoke curling from the chimney. "But looking at you all now, it seems to me you've figured it out." She reached for her fiancé's hand, her smile tender and sure. "They say a family's supposed to be one man and one woman, but I think love don't care how many hearts it takes to build a home." Her words landed deep, settling somewhere in Colt's chest like truth itself. He finished the haircut in silence, lost in thought. That night, long after the dishes were done and the lanterns were dimmed, Colt lit a single candle and set it in the center of the table. The warm light flickered across the wood, throwing long, quiet shadows. "Sit," he said softly. Josie and Willa exchanged puzzled looks, but did as he asked. Colt didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on Josie's shoulder, the other on Willa's. His face was calm, but his voice carried the weight of a man who had walked through fire and come out whole. "We've been through hell and come out the other side," he said, his tone low and rough. "And somehow we built something here that feels like peace." He glanced around the little cabin, the worn floorboards, the patched curtains, the scent of bread still lingering in the air. "This house ain't just logs and nails anymore," he said. "It's us." He turned to Josie first. "You're the heart of it. You're my peace, Josie. You taught me how to stop running from the hurt and start living again." Then he looked to Willa, his eyes softening. "And you're the fire. You brought laughter back into this place. You taught us to fight, but not with hate, with hope." He drew a deep breath, steadying himself. "The world's got rules, paper, preachers, words about what a family's supposed to be. I don't have any of that to give you," he paused. "But I've got my word, and my life, and both belong to you." He looked at them one after the other, and then together. "I'm asking you not by the laws of men, but by the truth of our own hearts. Will you be my family, Will you let me spend the rest of my days loving you both, right here, under this roof?" Tears welled in their eyes before the words even reached their lips. Josie reached up first, covering his hand with hers. Willa followed her fingers, trembling but sure. And in the glow of that single candle, beneath the whispering wind of the prairie night, they both said yes. It wasn't a wedding the world would recognize, but it was a union the stars themselves might have blessed. The story closes on a sunset, much like any other broad, golden endless. The three of them sit together on the front porch as the sky burns itself out over the plains. Colt sits on the step, a block of cedar in his hands, carving a bird in the fading light. Josie rocks slowly beside him, a blanket over her knees, her hand resting on his shoulder. Willa swings gently on the porch swing, humming a tune as she weaves the last of the season's flowers into a braid of color. There's no need for words between them. The silence itself feels sacred. They've faced judgment, endured loss, and come out standing. Not because they changed the world, but because they refused to let the world change them. Their love isn't something that fits neatly into the preacher's book or the town's gossip. It's something older, truer. Love, they've learned, isn't a prize or a promise written in ink. It's a place, a shelter built from broken pieces, a quiet refuge strong enough to hold three hearts that the world tried to break, and gentle enough to let them heal. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.